Well, if a kid wants to do competitive sports, I suggest encouraging swimming, cross-country running, and track and field. These can produce lifelong healthy habits and fitness skills at very low risk for brain injury. Baseball, softball, and basketball for boys are pretty good choices too. For higher risk sports, my suggestion is keep kids from playing them until they're older. The older, the better. For parents in schools who love football, like I do, shift to flag football until the kids are at least 16, and 18 years old would be even better. For girls, heading the ball should not be part of soccer until at least age 16. Look, I recognize that this is hard advice. There's a lot of pressure to start kids in sports younger and younger. And I recognize that we need to balance risks against other valuable things that come out of sports, maybe especially risky sports. Hi, I'm Justin Barrett. I'm president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a former university professor and psychological scientist. And this channel explores how to think better, to live better as a sciencey person and a Christian. In this episode, I want to talk about protecting the noggin, or the brain, especially in connection with youth sports. Unfortunately, most of us are not bouncy, flouncy, trouncy, pouncy, fun with our tops made out of rubbers and our bottoms made out of springs like Tigger. We can have head injuries, and that's kind of a bad thing. This topic has been on my mind ever since I did a little bit of research for the Aging After 65 series, when I discovered that there's pretty sound evidence that concussions, especially concussions very early in life, are risk factors for dementia later in life. That's a worrisome thing. But I was also, this sort of came home to me because one of my coworkers has been suffering from long-term consequences of just a freak accident concussion for over 9 months now. She hasn't quite right. In many respects. And it's very disturbing for her and disordering for her life. And so I wanted to pay a little bit more attention to the issue of concussions. Maybe the one little anecdote that really got me going, was a 32-year-old friend who recently shared how when he was in high school playing football, one of the drills for, I believe he said, for linebackers was actually lining up in two lines and really smashing each other in the head, headbutting each other, of course, with helmets on, but repeatedly. And he got a concussion from this very clearly. So I want to talk about concussions and how do we protect our brains and our kids' brains, or the kids in our lives' brains that we care about. And I warn you that some of my conclusions are a bit countercultural. But let me start with 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20, where the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, says, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." Now, the broader context of this quotation, Paul has been talking about being careful with how we use our bodies sexually and in relation to food. He's not talking about concussions. So I want to be clear. I recognize that. But I do think there's a general principle here that can be extended with some care to other ways of caring for our bodies, such as through exercise and sports. After all, how can we love the Lord well with all of our hearts, souls, minds, and strengths if we have weak minds and little strength? Now, the part of our bodies that might be especially important for us to care for is our brains. Our brain is, right, part of our body. It's an important organ in our bodies. And we know that one of the most distinctive things about us humans, the kind of animal we are, and compared to other animals, is our really big brains. For the size of our bodies, type of animal we are, we have massive brains. Depending on how you calculate it, somewhere on the order of 5 to 7 times larger than an average animal for our body's type. Our brains are big and complex because they're so important for our lives. Humans also have very long lives compared to other animals. We need our brain for a good long time is the point. So yes, put those two facts together. We have big brains. They're really important to the kind of animal we are, and we live a super long time compared to other mammals. We need to keep our brains healthy for a long time. Recent scientific evidence, research of various sorts, suggests that, as I mentioned in the outset, that big risk factor for dementia when we're older is childhood concussions. Banging up our brains can have these long-term consequences. The more concussions you've had in childhood, the higher you are at risk for dementia, Alzheimer's, and other kinds of dementia in old age. It's not that you definitely will, but the risk goes up considerably the more concussions that you've had. And of course, we know that once you've had a concussion, it's easier to get another one, especially close together time-wise. Concussions also have lots of negative consequences right after the brain trauma, which is what a concussion is. It can be harder to concentrate, to read, to focus on computer screens, to maintain balance, to stay awake sometimes, and so on. Usually these symptoms do fade in a few days or a week or so, but sometimes they linger for many months. It's not unheard of for the consequences of concussion to last for a year or more. And that can have, of course, detrimental impact on schoolwork if you're a kid or on your job if you're a grown-up. My point, as I hope we all know, concussions are bad, real bad, now and for later in life too. They aren't like getting a sprained wrist in the 3rd grade that'll heal and you'll never know that it was ever injured. Concussions can have enduring consequences. So as parents, teachers, aunts and uncles, older cousins, grandparents, or whomever, others who care for kids and want them to have long, healthy, productive lives, preventing brain injuries, concussions, ought to be a high priority. We should discourage kids from engaging in activities that put their brains at risk and provide them with proper equipment to protect their heads when their brains are at risk. Well, that just opens up the next question. Well, what are these particularly risky activities for the brain? So I've done a quick dive into the scientific research. And I mean, sadly, one of the things it's taught me is it's really hard to get very, good, high quality, clear evidence. Part of this is because, of course, you can't experimentally study kids getting brain injuries, because that would mean assigning some kids to the concussion group and some to the control condition and seeing what the consequences are, and we don't do that. That's bad. That'd be unethical. So we have to use correlational and cross-sectional kinds of studies. And typically what we're using is medical records, either from schools or hospitals or other kinds of public agencies. And then they're often clumped together, the types of injuries. So it's hard to just pick out just concussions from all of these different kinds of sports and recreation related injuries. That's one of the weaknesses of the data set. We also often know more about reported injuries or injuries treated at hospitals, but we don't know a lot about the unreported or self-treated injuries. So for example, it's suspected that boxing injuries are way underreported because in boxing, you expect to get hurt. Good boxing facilities have sort of first aid on hand, so people aren't going to hospitals or medical care professionals, and it's not getting then recorded in the same way. They just take care of it and they expect it. So those may go underreported. We also seem to know more about which activities have played a role in an injury rather than how likely it is to get an injury based upon how many times somebody engages in the activities. And a clear example is basketball. Basketball injuries may be the most commonly reported kind of sports or recreation activity injury. But that doesn't mean basketball is more dangerous than all of the other sports. It just means more people are playing basketball. You can kind of see what the problem is there. We need some kind of measure of how many people are playing particular or engaged in particular activities and what their frequency of engagement is, and then the kinds of injuries they're getting. Those are hard data to come by. So the picture is a bit fuzzy and complicated. That said, a small number of studies do seem to try to tease apart those different factors and do a pretty good job of it, mostly for school-related sports and activities, because there are much better records. So what do we find in those kinds of studies? Well, we find some good news and we find some not as good news. The good news is the incidence of concussions over the past couple of decades seems to be going down. And it may be going down because coaches, parents, and players are becoming more sensitive to the importance of preventing concussions. And we're getting some improvements in training activities, training practices, and equipment. So that's good. There are lots of efforts have been made now to reduce the number of concussions in kids, and it looks like it's starting to pay off. More good news. There are lots of sports out there that have very, very low incidences of concussions these days, as measured by the number of concussions per practice or competition. So for instance, concussions are very rare in swimming, track and field, and cross country. Risk is also fairly low in baseball and softball. So that's some good news. Not as good news. Well, sadly, on average, it looks like girls have a much greater risk of concussion in comparable sports than boys. For instance, whereas the risk of a concussion for boys playing basketball, as I mentioned, is very low, it's about the same for girls playing softball. The risk for girls playing basketball is about 3 times as great as it is for boys. At least in one study, the rate of girls getting concussions playing basketball is greater than boys' soccer or wrestling. That was surprising to me. Girls' soccer is also twice as risky for concussions as boys' soccer, as risky as boys' ice hockey. There's also evidence that girls and women seem to recover much more slowly from concussions than boys or men do. It isn't entirely clear why that is. That kind of research is ongoing. Scientists are looking into it. There are lots of different hypotheses out there, but as far as I can tell, there's not a settled view on what the determinative factors are. What's also not good news? Well, there are several sports, pretty popular sports, that have pretty substantial risks of brain trauma. The worst offenders, basketball, soccer, and lacrosse for girls, are pretty high risk. For boys, wrestling, lacrosse, ice hockey, and American football. But football stands out as especially dangerous. It has twice the risk of concussion as wrestling or lacrosse. It's 5 times riskier than basketball for boys. Now, if you're thinking about other kinds of activities, evidence seems to point to cycling is another kind. Riding bicycles is especially risky, but there it may depend very much on the type of bicycling that's going on. Is it sort of stunt riding? Is it BMX? Is it mountain biking? How is somebody riding? The bottom line, even with great improvements with concussion protocols, training, and equipment, American football and girls soccer are high risk for kids' brain health. And we'll link to one of these studies so that you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out some of these really interesting risk tables and frequency of injury tables. So my advice, what does this boil down to? Well, if a kid wants to do competitive sports, I suggest encouraging swimming, cross-country running, and track and field. These can produce lifelong healthy habits and fitness skills at very low risk for brain injury. Baseball, softball, and basketball for boys are pretty good choices too. For higher risk sports, my suggestion is keep kids from playing them until they're older. The older, the better. For parents and schools who love football, like I do, shift to flag football until the kids are at least 16, and 18 years old would be even better. For girls, heading the ball should not be part of soccer until at least age 16. Look, I recognize that this is hard advice. There's a lot of pressure to start kids in sports younger and younger. And I recognize that we need to balance risks against other valuable things that come out of sports, maybe especially risky sports. Some risk-taking is an important part of childhood. There's evidence that making playgrounds too safe can be counterproductive because kids don't learn how to take appropriate risks. They don't know how to gauge how far out to swing. They don't know how to use fear as a proper check on what is safe play and what isn't. So they take risks they shouldn't, and they get hurt anyway because everything feels so safe. Kids' environments that are too safe have been shown to actually be linked with more fears later in life because they didn't learn how to confront their fears and overcome them, like fears of heights. So kids in too safe of environments can end up being very timid and scaredy cats later in life. Not helpful. If we want courageous kids, courage is cultivated by confronting those fears. So some risks are good, but competition and social pressures around competitive team sports, the kinds of pressures that peers and maybe especially adults can put on kids, can push kids and their coaches to unproductive and dangerous risks, like headbutting drills. Who thought that was a good idea? If we start thinking about the health of a child in terms of an 80-year-long lifespan instead of just who they are right now, I think it starts putting that idea of Friday night lights glory into a different perspective. Maybe it's not worth it so much to push them into risky situations to injure their heads especially. And as I mentioned in my second episode concerning the Olympics, the claim that somehow sports are important for kids to build up character, strengths, and virtues for the rest of life really just is not supported by the research. There's just not that much evidence that sports do have generalizable virtues that are cultivated within them, that extend outside of them. The sports that do have the strongest evidence of this is good for developing teamwork and perseverance and courage and all of that are actually the so-called minor sports like cross-country running, rowing, swimming, that are low risk for brain injury too. So I'm afraid the truth is we like to watch kids play sports. We like to watch young people do these athletic kinds of competitions. We like to be able to brag about our kids' or grandkids' athletic abilities. And there's something bonding for a community around high school sports, maybe especially football. But that doesn't mean it's good for our kids. So when we support our kids in these sports that are risky for their brains, we really need to ask ourselves, are we doing it for them? Are we doing them any favors, especially if we think long term? Or is it more to protect ourselves from feeling left out, from social conflict, or from losing a source of entertainment? I'm afraid that's where I'm coming down on the whole issue of concussions in youth sports. If we're really looking out for our kids' brains and lifelong well-being, we're probably going to discourage high-risk sports at young ages as much as we can. That's my sobering take on concussions in youth sports. I'd love to hear what you think. Please like and subscribe, leave comments, suggestions. I do try to respond to comments the best I can if I think I've got something useful to say. And by all means, suggest topics that you'd like to hear me talk about. I'm Justin Barrett. Thanks for joining me, and protect that noggin.